The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. That was the detail Odalis Ferreira would remember years later. Not the silence of the people, but the silence of the building itself, as if even the ventilation system had paused to see what she would do next. But that came later. First, there was the door. The door to the Meridian Conference Center in Ottawa was glass, floor to ceiling, and Odalis could see her reflection in it before she pushed it through. She was 26 years old. She was wearing the blazer she'd bought at Value Village 3 years ago and ironed that morning until the collar lay exactly flat. She was carrying a folder that contained 4 years of work, and she was about to walk into a room full of people who had already decided she didn't belong there. She pushed the door open anyway. The Meridian Spring Symposium on Structural Engineering was one of those events that looked democratic on its website and felt like a private club the moment you stepped inside. The attendees wore lanyards with institution names printed in fonts that implied permanence. University of Toronto, McGill, École Polytechnique, the Federal Infrastructure Office. Odalis's lanyard said Northern Polytechnic Institute, Sudbury. The font was the same size. The weight it carried in this room was not. She found her seat near the back, between a pillar and a potted plant that someone had let go dry. The keynote speaker was already at the podium. Dr. Harold Wingate, Chief Structural Advisor to the federal government, a man whose name appeared on the covers of 3 textbooks Odalis had studied in school. He was speaking about a problem in bridge span load modeling that had stalled infrastructure planning for the better part of 2 decades. The equation at the center of it, a distributed stress coefficient model first proposed in 1987, had never been fully resolved for asymmetric load conditions. Every major firm in the country had tried. The federal office had tried. 3 PhDs had written dissertations about why it couldn't be done, without rebuilding the foundational assumptions from scratch. Dr. Wingate said this with the tone of a man who had made peace with an unfortunate truth. "We are asking the room," he said, "as we do every year, whether anyone has a new approach to offer. And every year," he smiled, the kind of smile that isn't actually a smile. "The room is very wise and says nothing." Odalis's hand went up. She didn't plan it. She would tell people that for years afterward, and they would not entirely believe her, but it was true. Her hand went up the way your hand goes up when you've been holding something heavy for too long. Not from decision, but from the simple failure of muscle. The room turned. Dr. Wingate looked at her over the rim of his glasses. Beside him at the panel table sat Dr. Elspeth Morrow of McGill, Dr. Raj Subramaniam of the Federal Infrastructure Office, and Dr. Frederick Lorne, who had been the country's foremost voice on load-bearing coefficient theory for 30 years. All 3 of them looked at Odalis the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong place. "You have a contribution?" Dr. Wingate said. His tone was the verbal equivalent of a politely raised eyebrow. "I do," Odalis said. Someone behind her coughed. Not a sick cough. The other kind. "And you're with?" Dr. Wingate glanced at the lanyard. "Northern Polytechnic," Odalis said. She said it clearly, the way her mother had taught her to say her last name when she was 7 years old and the kids at school kept mispronouncing it on purpose. "You say it like you mean it, Mija. You say it like it's the only correct way." Dr. Frederick Lorne leaned toward his microphone. He was 71 years old. The author of the definitive paper on asymmetric load distribution, and he had a way of speaking that made everything he said sound like the conclusion of an argument you had already lost. "The asymmetric coefficient problem," he said slowly, "has been examined by some of the finest structural minds in this country, and indeed in the world. It is not a matter of insufficient effort. The mathematical constraints themselves create an irresolvable tension. We appreciate," and here he paused in a way that made the word appreciate mean the opposite of itself, "the enthusiasm of early career researchers, but perhaps observing the session would be more productive than." "I solved it," Odalis said. The air conditioning stopped, or maybe it didn't, and the room just got that loud in her ears. Dr. Lorne did not respond immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Dr. Wingate, and then he looked back at her. And the expression on his face was one that Odalis recognized because she had been seeing versions of it her entire life. It was the expression of a person recalibrating, not their opinion of her, not yet, but their understanding of how firmly they needed to hold it. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The irresolvable tension you mentioned," Odalis said. "It's only irresolvable if you preserve the 1987 boundary conditions. If you restate the span variable as a piecewise function and model the load asymmetry in two stages rather than concurrently, the tension disappears. The coefficient becomes derivable." She paused. "I have the work here." She held up the folder. Someone in the front row, she couldn't see who, actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Dr. Wingate said, "That's a very significant claim." "I know," Odalis said. "The 1987 boundary conditions are foundational to the entire model. Restating the span variable would require revalidating 4 supporting theorems and rebuilding the derivation sequence," Odalis said. "Yes, that's what the folder contains." The room was doing the thing rooms do when something unexpected has entered them. People were shifting. People were looking at each other. People were making tiny calculations about what was appropriate to feel. Dr. Elspeth Morrow, who had said nothing yet, leaned forward. She was 63, the head of McGill's structural engineering faculty, and she had a reputation for being the sharpest person in whatever room she entered. She looked at Odalis with an expression that was not dismissive. It was something more careful than that. "Walk us through it," Dr. Morrow said. "Not show us your work. Not let's see what you've got. Walk us through it," like she was speaking to a colleague. Odalis breathed. She walked to the front of the room. The distance from the back row to the panel table was maybe 30 feet. Odalis counted her steps without meaning to. Her grandmother had told her once, when she was 9 years old and terrified of her first school recital, "When you're nervous, count something, anything. It gives your brain something to hold on to, while the rest of you catches up." Odalis had counted ceiling tiles that day. She had counted steps today. 16 steps. She set her folder on the table, opened it to the first page, and began. The derivation took 40 minutes. She had done it so many times in the past 3 years. Alone in her apartment in Sudbury, in the margins of other people's papers, on the back of a grocery receipt she'd found in her coat pocket on the bus. That the sequence lived in her hands now, not just her head. She wrote on the whiteboard that a conference volunteer had wheeled to the front without being asked. The marker squeaking on the surface in a way that was the only sound in the room. Dr. Lorne interrupted her twice in the first 10 minutes. Once to challenge her restating of the boundary condition, once to point out what he called an obvious error in her third line of derivation. Odalis answered both without stopping. She didn't say "you're wrong." She said if we follow that through, and then followed it through, slowly, until the place where his objection resolved into her result and not his. She did it the way her father had taught her to have arguments. Not as battles you win or lose, but as things you walk through together until you're both looking at the same truth. Her father had been an electrician in Sudbury for 22 years. He had never gone to university. He had understood load distribution in practical terms before Odalis ever knew the mathematics of it, because he had spent 2 decades calculating what a structure could hold before it failed. "You show your work every time," he had told her. "Every single time. Not because you have to, because then they can't say you didn't." She showed her work. By the 20-minute mark, Dr. Lorne had stopped interrupting. By the 30-minute mark, he had pulled his copy of her pages. The conference volunteer had distributed them while she worked, close to his face, and was not looking at the board at all. By the 38th minute, Dr. Morrow had borrowed a pen from the person beside her and was writing in the margin of her own copy. Odalis wrote the final coefficient on the board and set the marker down. The room did not applaud. It did something that was, in some ways, louder than applause. It went completely still. Dr. Wingate took off his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the board. He looked at the pages in his hand. He looked at the board again. Dr. Lorne had not moved in 4 minutes. He was still looking at his copy. His pen was in his hand, but he hadn't written anything. His mouth was open very slightly, the way a door is open when someone has walked through it and forgotten to close it behind them. It was Dr. Morrow who spoke first. "Miss Ferreira," she said, and then she stopped and started again. "Miss Ferreira, how long have you been working on this?" 3 years, 8 months, Odalis said. "Second year undergraduate." "Yes." Dr. Morrow looked at her for a long moment. "Who supervised this work?" "Professor Anita Chukwuemeka, NPI Department of Civil and Structural Engineering." Dr. Morrow wrote that down. Someone in the third row raised their hand. Then someone else. Then a man near the window who had been leaning back with his arms folded for the first half of the session was now sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, his hand raised with the others. Odalis answered questions for another 40 minutes. There was a question about revalidation methodology. There was a question about computational modeling implications. There was a question about whether the piecewise function held under extreme asymmetric load scenarios. And that one came from Dr. Lorne, who had reclosed his mouth by then and was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before and couldn't entirely name. It wasn't warm. It wasn't apologetic. It was something more stripped down than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who was looking at a result and had no choice, technically, but to look at it. She answered his question. He nodded once. She gathered her pages at the end. The conference volunteer, a young man with a red lanyard and an expression of complete bewilderment, brought her a glass of water that she hadn't asked for. She drank it. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. They had been steady the whole time. She didn't know when that had happened. Outside, in the lobby of the Meridian Center, the light was the kind of flat Ottawa afternoon light that doesn't commit to any particular mood. Odalis sat on a bench near the coat check and thought about calling her mother. She thought about it for a while, and then she called her father instead. "How did it go?" he said, without preamble, because he always knew when she was calling about something specific. "Fine," she said. "Fine like it went okay, or fine like they're going to publish it," she said. "Dr. Morrow wants to co-author the submission. She said the validation paper could come out by fall." There was silence on the line. A long silence, the kind her father made when he was doing the thing he did, where he held on to something before he said it, turned it over a few times, made sure he had the right words. "Mija," he said finally. "Yeah," she said. "Your grandmother would have said, count to 3 before you do anything else." "I know. She would have also said, don't let them put their name before yours." Odalis laughed. It came out shorter than she expected, a little ragged at the edges, the way laughing sometimes is when it's carrying more than just the funny thing. "I'll negotiate," she said. "You'll win," her father said. She sat for another minute after she hung up. Around her, people were streaming out of the conference room, talking in 2s and 3s, some of them looking in her direction, and then looking away with the specific studied casualness of people recalibrating something. Dr. Lorne walked past without speaking to her. He had her folder under his arm. She hadn't given him permission to take it. She thought about saying something. She sat with that thought, and then she let it go, because the folder was a copy, and the original was on her hard drive, and the submission would have her name on it, and some things you win by saying nothing and simply having been correct. 2 weeks later, Dr. Morrow sent her an email. The subject line was Ray. Ferreira coefficient. Journal submission. The opening line read, "I want to be clear that this work is yours, and the citation will reflect that." Odalis read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her father with no message, just the email itself, which was its own kind of sentence. The paper was published the following September in the Canadian Journal of Structural Engineering. The derivation was formally named in the submission, per standard practice, for the person who originated it. It was called the Ferreira method. In Sudbury, a professor named Anita Chukwuemeka printed the published paper, and taped it to the door of her office in the NPI engineering department, where it stayed for years. Beside the fire exit sign, below the hook where students left their thermoses, in the exact kind of unheroic, ordinary location where real things tend to actually live, the door to Dr. Chukwemeka's office was always open. No one ever had to knock.